Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump. I'm Steve Ray, and this is Bookmarks. Hello and welcome to Bookmarks. I'm your host, Steve Ray. American college campuses have been hotbeds for activism for years, but a recent trend has seen this activism take a more radical turn, with some students shutting down speakers and demanding faculty resignation for perceived offenses. This new radicalism is the subject of a new book, Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump, by Robby Soave. Mr. Soave joins us today to discuss his book. He is an associate editor at Reason.com, where he writes about free speech, education policy, school safety, criminal justice reform, and television. He appears regularly on TV and radio and has published articles in the New York Times, New York Post, CNN, USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, and Newsweek. And joining us to critique the book is Sanford Ungar, director of the Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. He previously served as the 10th president of Goucher College in Baltimore and was director of the Voice of America. He also served as the dean of the School of Communication at American University and was an award-winning co-host of NPR's All Things Considered. He is the author or editor of 6 nonfiction books. Thank you both for joining us. Can I call you Sandy?
You may, certainly.
Terrific. And Robby?
Thank you for having me.
So, Robby, could you give us, in a nutshell, the basis, the thesis behind this book?
Sure. The book is an attempt to grapple with a phenomenon that I think many people are becoming more aware of, which is the climate of censorship, not everywhere, but on certain college campuses, but particularly the troubling streak at many of our most elite educational institutions, places like Harvard, Yale, etc., where some students, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but some students of a progressive bent are more inclined to shut down speakers they disagree with.
Gotcha. Now, Sandy, what is your critique of the context and content of this book?
Well, first of all, Robby's a friend of mine. I admire him. I like his writing. I think many parts of this book are very engaging, and I congratulate you for it.
Well, thank you.
There is a veneer of objectivity in the way the book is presented, that you're pointing up extremes on both sides, but I noticed that just now you only chose to highlight one side. And I am actually pleased by that, because it reveals what I think to be the fundamental bias of your book, that you want to appear to be concerned about extremism on both sides, but it's really what you regard as the extremism on the left that you focus most of your attention on. And in doing so, I think you mischaracterize some things and neglect some others.
So historically, you go back, in some cases, all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. You look at the second wave of feminism, second wave obviously after suffrage. You look at race relations, gender equality. There literally doesn't seem to be an area of life that isn't touched by this idea that there is a whole new set of radicals. Was there something specific in the timeline that triggered you thinking this would be a good topic to cover with a fairly broad brush on both sides?
Sure. It was the incident at Yale, I think, that first brought so many captured so many people's attention. That was when a dean there of the college was shouted at, was berated by a whole group of students in a public place who were making demands that really spoke to the kind of safe space mentality, or whatever you want to call it, where they were explicitly saying things like, we want this to be a campus where we feel comforted and safe in an emotional capacity at all times, and we see that as it's your job to provide that. And that was kind of and to sort of address a very fair criticism, mind you, that Sandy raises, I was interested in the change on the left particularly, which is why I didn't give the right equal. The book certainly does not give the right equal focus. I think if I were to write a follow-up book, I would be more condemning of the trends I've seen on the right. Really, even in the last year, I think things have gotten much worse coming from the right, which was after the book was already being edited. So I don't know if that's a partial explanation.
Well, the incident at Yale, I remember exactly the incident you're talking about. I was involved in my first year of teaching full-time on free speech issues when that happened. And of course, the students that was an incident. It was not emblematic of anything in particular. It was an incident. Some students behaved very badly. There was a lot of foolishness on the part of some university administrators, I'd say, in both directions. I think when a university gets into telling students what Halloween costumes to wear, only trouble will ensue. And I think there were well-intentioned people, probably on both sides, but it became very nasty. I think if we draw back a little bit further, it's important to say, Robby, that I'm concerned that you're focusing on a particular. It's popular to do so. I recognize that. It's probably selling books, and we'll probably sell them well, to characterize what's going on college campuses as this terrible dissolution of comedy, comity, not comedy. We need more comedy of both sorts on campuses, and to ignore some of what the things happening on the other side. And as you know, I'm involved in a project at Georgetown University where we're tracking challenges to free speech in this country over the past several years and going forward. And we found that speech is suppressed on all across the political spectrum, not just on one side. And I wish there were some examples in your book so that people would get a better context, a more balanced and nuanced view of what's happening on the other side.
Sandy, let me ask you this. From the greatest generation through the age of Aquarius, now to what he's calling the age of Trump, is this premise
quite a transition,
a natural progression, and is this the natural outcome of what we saw, let's say, in the Occupy movement before Mr. Trump announced his candidacy?
Oh, I think we make too much of some of these movements when we look back at them in retrospect. The Occupy movement, I think we understand how it happened, why it happened, a tremendous amount of alienation and not knowing what to do, what kind of future to find. And there are these phases. Many years ago, I covered the worker-student revolt in France as a young reporter in 1968. That's quite a while before Robby was born, I suspect. But there was a piece in Le Monde, the great intellectual French daily newspaper, in which a famous journalist called Pierre Vincent-Pontet wrote "Quand la France s'ennuie," when France gets bored. He basically said, when France gets bored, watch out for what's going to happen. And so Charles de Gaulle was brought down, worker-student revolt, and it became the epitome of that sense of alienation at that time. I think we've been through a lot of phases like that in this country. Some of them we're more aware of than others, but I think that how Trump came about is a very complex phenomenon.
Well, I try to be careful about making broad or sweeping generational claims because they're always difficult. And I'm sure I do a little bit of the book, but because there are some broad claims you can draw some of the time. But of course, I don't think most young people really are characterized by the kinds of activism that I describe and to a great degree criticize in the book. I think it's been a small number of activist-type people who have engaged in tactics that kind of threaten a traditionally liberal, classically liberal, or ACLU-type liberal outlook. And though they are small in number, they have had a pronounced effect on campuses. And the sort of the feminist activism, I think, is one of the more clear examples of that. You know, when I was on campus not that long ago, the University of Michigan, 2006 to 2010, a decade ago, I guess. And it would have been no question, I think, for most of the progressive activists, or at least the ones I remember talking to staunchly defend, again, the way like that the ACLU does, due process rights for people accused of wrongdoing. And the change on that issue has been fairly quick and fairly total among progressive activists regarding people accused of things on campus.
Define who those progressive activists are for me, will you, Robby? Because that's a very broad term and a vague term, and I want to understand just who's in your category.
There's an entire group of people who, the Title IX activists, Title IX is the statute having to do with gender-based discrimination that can be used and has been interpreted by various government agencies to mandate some kind of how we deal with misconduct claims. There's a Know Your Nine organization. There's broad. This contingent of what I call the intersectional left is probably more organized and centrally mandated or managed than some of the others.
But Robby, is that? I'm sorry.
No, that's
Steve,
okay. Please.
Is that essentially different from Second Amendment activists who try to make sure that people know their gun rights, who try to make sure that they stay alert and astute and ready to pounce when the moment comes? I think what you're describing is something that goes on both sides, and there are, of course, there are extremes, there are abuses, there are absurdities, there are things that happen that, when you look at them from a slight distance, seem totally ridiculous. But I'm not sure that what you're describing is all that surprising. There's Title IX. People have come to see it as applied to sexual assault, as well as how many athletic teams. Title IX was pretty safe when people were just talking about how many men's and women's sports teams there were at universities. But when it starts getting applied in some other ways, then it gets more controversial, and of course people are going to defend their rights. I don't see this as a great decay of anything.
But I think it is a change. I think the comparison would be if Second Amendment activist people suddenly started advocating things contrary to the protections of rights that the Second Amendment is about. You might disagree with the Second Amendment, but it's supposed to be a protection of people's rights to own guns. The Title IX activists it's a category of activism to sort of limit people's rights or argue that they should not have these rights in these kinds of proceedings, that flies in the face of sort of other Bill of Rights protections that is different for the left. What I'm saying is I'm saying the left would have used to be against these kinds of changes, and I think very rapidly it became an open question of where are we going to allow people we really don't like to have due process rights, or in the case of speech, Nazis, far-right people, anti-Semites, should they have rights? Where on the left has been the category of people who for decades have said, yes, absolutely, no question. Whereas the people on the right have not had that similar sort of long history of support for these rights. So some of it was my surprise at this group changing its position, rather than to say that, well, that makes them worse than the right.
And not particularly successfully changing advocating their position. People still have people who are charged with crimes still have opportunities and rights to defend themselves. I think the question comes sometimes in internal university proceedings. There may be some things happening that we all have to be concerned about. I can see that. But I think the system has a way of hearing things emerge on the extremes and pushing them back. I don't know whether that will continue to happen. May I, Steve?
Certainly.
Robby referred to the alt-right as the two particular quotes I found were a marginal group, the alt-right, and a fringe movement, and not something to worry very much about. Now, I will concede, if you finished your book about a year ago while it was in process, that you might write differently about it today, because that doesn't sound like an accurate description of the alt-right that I see with my free speech project, that we're tracking infringement of speech rights and other First Amendment freedoms. The alt-right is right up there with wanting to cut back on people's inherent rights. And it's something to worry about. They're armed, they're dangerous, There's a whole piece of the internet that they occupy, and I don't think they're a fringe movement. I think they're a real threat to us.
And well, electronically has certainly been the domain of, so for instance, for the alt-right, so their major negative impact on our society has been the online harassment that they propagate in huge volumes. Obviously, they've been responsible for some violence as well, which is contemptible. It's been a small amount of violence.
It's not such a small amount of violence.
I mean, it's small in how much violence. There's not a lot of politically motivated violence in this country, thank God. You're right. They're responsible for a large amount of it, but it's a small amount of violence. I think their bigger impact on our culture, on our dialogue, has been their harassment campaigns against people online. And then it depends how broadly. So when I'm speaking of the alt-right, I'm only speaking of like the actual alt-right, Richard Spencer's movement, which I do think is a small number of people. I think they probably had their high water mark at Charlottesville and have receded somewhat. Not they haven't disappeared at all. If you're talking just more broadly, people on the right, like Candace Owens, Turning Point, etc., yes, they're certainly doing their fair share of, this professor said something we don't like, can we get them fired? There was an effort to get a professor who said he was part of Antifa, or he had sympathy for Antifa. Just this week, I wrote an article defending his right to say that, and it was absolutely wrong to fire him. There's tons of that coming out of the regular far right. I would not say that's alt-right in its.
And I don't think Antifa represents the left or liberals generally by any means. I think that is an extreme movement. But I think, just to press this one point, I think the FBI would tell you that there has been more violence, there have been more deaths caused by terrorists on the right than the much vaunted Islamic terrorists, who have not actually created much damage in this country, many other parts of the world. So if you just death per death, or threat per threat, danger per danger, fear per fear, there's more to worry about from this movement that you called a marginal group than from the
Well,
left.
I mean, I don't spend any time in my book, saying that there's some threat from Islamic domestic terrorism.
No, you don't.
That's something
don't.
A conservative would say, I'm a libertarian, I'm worried about surveillance of all kinds of groups.
Right.
I don't think there's any. I think both of those groups present very little threat to Americans' physical safety. You're right, of the ideologically motivated violence, just like I said, there has been more right-wing violence than Islamic violence.
Yeah,
only
and
if we start counting on September 12th, not in 2001, but...
I'd like to see you making that point in your book. I'd like to see you paying attention to various parts of the right and how they are suppressing not just speech, but in some cases human activity. I mean, there's a lot of danger coming from these people.
All right, now let's take some questions from our viewers. And a reminder, for any show that you see on publicsquare.net, you can submit a question or content via the website, again, publicsquare.net, or via our Twitter feed. The handle is publicsquarenet. And this first question from Susie Hammond. What will it take for college administrators to stand up to student activist thugs?
Well, I'm not in a position of authority at Georgetown. I just run my little garden at Georgetown, revealing threats to the First Amendment. But I was a college president for 13 years, and I confronted many thugs. The questioner might not, and I might not have the same definitions of thug, but I prevented people from disrupting public programs. And by the way, I made it a particular point of having speakers from all across the political spectrum, and I can document that with names. And if people tried to prevent anyone from speaking, I threw them out of the room, or I had campus security throw them out of the room. So I have dealt with that, and I think many other people have too. You don't hear about that. You don't tend to hear about the fact, because who's going to say, what speaker is going to say, well, I was just at Goucher College where I happened to have been president, and I got to give my speech and nobody disrupted me. They're not going to say that. And if they did say it, no one's going to cover it, because that's not That's
Good news doesn't make
well,
top of the
the
fold.
airplanes land.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
we don't report it every
News
time.
is things that happen, not things
That's
that
right.
don't happen.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So this is this thuggery, as she's speaking about, reminiscent of Berkeley in the late 60s, and are we headed that way? And what can college administrators do to stand up to them?
Well, I almost posit Berkeley in the 60s is a positive example.
I happen
of
to agree with
students,
you about
of
that.
students, boldly saying the administration has no right to put limits on the kind of political speech we can engage in. What I want to happen today more so is I think many students and professors, not all of them, and this varies wildly from college to college, is part of the difficulty in writing, a book about a broad sort of trend when things are so different from college to college. For professors in particular, to feel that if they criticize their radical students or criticize their tactics, that they will not be investigated, that administrators will not come for them. That is something that needs to happen. The faculty needs to know that their academic freedom is absolutely going to be observed, certainly at many campuses.
Across the political spectrum.
Yes.
Right.
And liberals or progressive faculty members, I don't know how the word progressive got a bad name. It's not a bad thing to be progressive. They have to be sure that
Certainly.
that others are not coming to get them. People taking cell phone videos in class, reporting them to right-wing organizations, and creating problems for them.
That actually goes to the next question we have from a Bernard Flowers. How much of the activism against hate speech is leftists trying to make conservative views taboo?
I mean, certainly some of it. I mean, I'd not be saying anything that is odd to anyone to point out that many campuses, certainly if we're talking about the most elite campuses, the most sort of liberal arts colleges, are overwhelmingly lean to the left. The people on campus are overwhelmingly to the left. The professors are overwhelmingly to the left. Probably the administrators don't lean as heavily that way, but do also lean that way. So, special sort of care needs to be taken that we're not just utterly trampling the few dissenters on these campuses, which I think is what some, again, this is not the generation, this is not most people, I think it's what some progressive activists want to do. I don't think it's necessarily most of them, but too many people have been afraid to tell them no.
Well, there you go, overgeneralizing again, Robby. And I think that, I have worked at 4 colleges or universities, one of which I ran over a long period of time. And I would have to say that at all of those places, in all these different historical periods, there was never an attempt to prevent dissenting views from being aired, from being spoken. There was never, there's not a failure to discuss conservative views on campuses today. It's just they're not discussed by Milo Yiannopoulos, with the circus clowns who come to perform. They're discussed with serious people who come to present arguments, discussions, historical revelations, etc. There's a lot of dialogue going on, not just at the places where I've worked, but at most colleges and universities. It's just not dramatic. It doesn't get attention.
Let's get to those points in our next segment called 3 Questions, where the reviewer asks 3 questions directly to the author. No, go ahead, Sandy. Sorry to interrupt.
Robby, why do you fall victim to using this term social justice warriors to smear people, progressives, liberals, who are in favor? Are you opposed to social justice? Is that the problem? I doubt it.
I am certainly not opposed to social justice. I'm probably opposed to some of the things that the people who are, I'm calling them social justice warriors. I'm not smearing them as that.
But why should, you're a libertarian. Why
Yes.
should you accept this kind of jargon, these
I don't know
epithets?
that I'm accepting that. I don't think I call them that from that's what people are calling them. So I'm pointing out that that's what they're being called more than me calling them that. I tend to call them social justice activists, which I don't think would necessarily even be offensive to them.
Do you mean it as a
activists for social
pejorative
justice.
term, though?
No, I mean it's simply descriptively. They are activists.
Well, we'd have to
they
sit
are
down
for
with your
social
book
justice.
and make sure you don't
I
fall.
don't think I call them that.
I'm
But I
not
do
so
agree
sure.
with you that, that, I mean, again, it depends what we're defining as social justice, but I'm broadly speaking a social liberal, and I want equality of gender and sex and LGBT status, and I think the criminal justice system needs great reform, and I support a lot of things, Black Lives Matter, all that stuff.
I don't know you well, but
So-
I believe that you're on
Yeah.
the proper side of many of those issues, on a side that we would share.
So, Professor, on the A through F scale, if that's applicable now, how would you grade this book?
Oh, wow.
Ooh, that's tough.
You have to
Yeah.
give me an A minus, because that's what everyone gets in college. You can't possibly get a lower grade than that.
Well,
Not that I didn't try, but...
Does he get more than a
Well, I went to college when it was quite possible to get lower grades than that.
Does Robby get more than a participation trophy for completing this tome?
No, he gets more than a participation trophy.
All
I
right,
would
let's have
give
it.
Robbie a B+ on this
I'm
book,
thrilled.
Wow.
which may be below the average grade in some places and some institutions,
thrilled.
but I
C's
give
get
him,
degrees, that's what we used to say.
Certainly didn't stand in my way.
so yes, I give him a B+. I wish, Robbie, that you would not call yourself a libertarian journalist. Why aren't you content to call yourself a journalist?
I think I need to be, that's a fair question. I think I need to be honest about some biases I might have, that I think many in the industry, the journalism industry, do have very serious ideological biases that they simply don't explain or acknowledge. So it'd be wrong for me not to say that my point of view or my skepticism of government authority specifically influences my coverage of things that I'm in. I mean, I think I have good reason to be skeptical of government.
I think we
authority,
all have good reason to
but-
be skeptical
right.
of government. No question about that. I have a little bit of a libertarian streak myself, but would you like all journalists to call themselves, to give themselves a label, an adjective like that?
I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it longer, but probably I would be better with that than people just not acknowledging biases that they clearly do have. I think probably that's the greater danger, although that's a tough one.
Thank you both. Really appreciate the insight on both sides here. Good conversation. That is all the time we have. And again, the book is Panic Attack, Young Radicals in the Age of Trump by Robby Soave. We'd like to thank Robby for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sandy for the review of the
My
book.
pleasure.
Both of you great insights. Sandy Ungar, of course, of the Free Speech Project, offering his critique. And thank you for watching Bookmarks. I'm Steve Ray. We'll see you next time.